A voice teacher stood in front of the class with a smirk. His arms crossed, eyes scanning the room until they locked on her, the woman sitting quietly in the back, in worn-out jeans and a plain floral shirt, clutching a notebook like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. His lips curled with the taste of superiority, and the moment he opened his mouth, the entire room froze. "Why don't you show us what opera sounds like, from someone like you? Let's see if you can handle Violetta's aria from the second act. Or is that too sophisticated for your background?" A few students chuckled nervously. Others looked away, uncomfortable, but no one said a word. It wasn't the first time he used someone to make a point. She was just next on his list. This wasn't a prestigious music school. It was a summer community workshop in Seattle, meant to be inclusive, accessible, a place where anyone could explore the power of opera. But to him, it was his stage, and anyone who didn't fit the image of refined artistry was treated like a mistake. She didn't look like someone who belonged in an opera hall, she looked like someone who cleaned them. And that was enough for him to decide she was worthless. He didn't ask if she had sung before. He didn't care why she was there. He saw someone he could use to boost his ego, to reinforce his authority. He wanted to break her in front of everyone. And that's exactly what he thought he was doing. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he mocked had sung in places he'd only dreamed of. She had stood on stages he would never be invited to, using a name he wouldn't recognize. Her voice had once made royalty weep and maestros beg. But now she was here, anonymous by choice, watching as a man who knew nothing about her tried to humiliate her with the very thing she mastered. And when she stood up, no one could have predicted what was coming. Not the students. Not the professor. Not even the woman herself. Because sometimes the most extraordinary comebacks begin with the deepest humiliation. And sometimes the voice you try to silence is the one that echoes loudest in the end. But what drove her to leave behind a world of glory and hide in plain sight? And what happens when the truth finally comes out? Thank you for tuning in. You're about to hear a story of pride, prejudice, and a breathtaking turnaround. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Hope Threads for more emotional and powerful stories like this one. Now, sit back, take a breath, and enjoy the ride. Jessica Lynn Turner walked into the Seattle Community Arts Center on a gray Tuesday morning with her hands deep in her coat pockets and her eyes low, fixed on the linoleum tiles that lined the narrow hallway. The center wasn't glamorous. It smelled faintly of floor polish and dust, the walls were covered in mismatched posters from past performances, and the ceiling lights flickered ever so slightly in a tired rhythm. It was the kind of place where dreams were born quietly, not with thunderous applause, but with the squeak of folding chairs and the echo of hesitant first notes. Jessica liked that about it. There was something disarming about its modesty, something human. She hadn't come here to impress. She hadn't come to be seen. She came because something inside her had cracked open after years of silence, and though she couldn't explain it, she knew she had to sing again, somewhere, somehow, even if it was just in a community workshop full of strangers who had no idea who she was or who she used to be. She was 42, though she didn't quite look it. Life had settled into her face gently, with faint lines at the edges of her eyes and a softness around her jaw that made her look approachable, almost maternal. Her long chestnut hair was usually pulled back into a low bun, not out of style but practicality. There was nothing ostentatious about her. Her clothes were simple, denim jeans, a faded cardigan, practical sneakers. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was soft but articulate, the kind of voice that made people lean in without realizing it. She didn't smile much, not because she was unfriendly, but because she had learned that people asked fewer questions when you kept your joy guarded. Jessica didn't want to talk about where she came from, what she had done before, or why she had suddenly appeared at this local arts center after years off the radar. She just wanted to sing. The summer workshop was led by Professor Thomas Harrington, a name whispered with both reverence and eye rolls depending on who you asked. He had once performed minor roles in national opera circuits, and though he hadn't set foot on a major stage in over a decade, he wore his resume like a crown. Tall, lean, and impeccably dressed, Harrington had a theatrical presence that demanded attention the moment he entered a room. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had convinced himself he was a genius, and the impatience of someone who believed everyone else was beneath him. He was known for his sharp tongue, his brutal critiques, and his unwavering belief that opera was not just music, it was class, elegance, a discipline reserved for the elite. And nothing infuriated him more than students who he deemed unworthy of the art form. Especially those who couldn't pay their way into prestigious programs. Especially women like Jessica. He noticed her the moment she walked in. Not because she made a scene, but precisely because she didn't. She didn't introduce herself with enthusiasm like the others, didn't hand him a printed vocal resume or boast about prior performances. She simply sat in the back row, quietly flipping through the sheet music provided, occasionally mouthing notes under her breath with a distant look in her eyes. It irritated him. Students were supposed to earn their place in his class through visible effort and obvious reverence. Jessica seemed disinterested, ungrateful even. And that made her a threat. Harrington couldn't stand the idea that someone might be quietly judging him, or worse, ignoring him entirely. He decided then and there that she was going to be an example. The class itself was a mix of aspiring vocalists, college students home for the summer, retirees chasing a long-postponed passion, and local artists hoping to refine their technique. There was a sense of camaraderie among them, a kind of unspoken pact of support, at least until Harrington entered the room. Then everything shifted. The energy dimmed, voices grew tense, and smiles became tight-lipped. Harrington didn't encourage, he dissected. His feedback was rarely constructive and often laced with sarcasm. And while he demanded perfection, he never offered warmth. To many, it was the price of learning from someone who'd been there, but to Jessica, it felt like something much worse, like a betrayal of what music was supposed to be. Jessica had been coming to the workshop for 3 weeks, arriving early, staying late, never causing trouble, never standing out. She blended in so seamlessly that most of the other students had stopped noticing her. But Harrington noticed. He watched her, studied her, looking for cracks. She was too composed. Too self-contained. He hated that. People like Jessica weren't supposed to survive in his world. Opera, to him, was about power. And power demanded hierarchy. So when the moment came to demonstrate a particularly complex aria from La Traviata, he saw his opportunity. The sheet music had just been passed around. Students were murmuring about its difficulty, some joking about needing months to prepare. Harrington turned slowly from the piano, his eyes landing on Jessica with calculated cruelty. "Why don't you give it a try?" he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You in the back. Yes, you. Let's see what you've got. Show us your interpretation of Violetta's Pain." His voice was syrupy with condescension. "Or is this too much for your level?" The room stilled. Jessica looked up, eyes wide but unreadable. A few heads turned toward her, some in curiosity, some in silent pity. One student whispered something to her neighbor and smirked. Jessica slowly rose from her seat, taking a breath so subtle most missed it. She didn't speak. Didn't object. Just walked toward the front of the room with the posture of someone who had nothing to lose. But inside, her heart was pounding. Not because she was afraid of the aria. But because she had sworn never to sing it again. The grand piano stood like a beast in the center of the room, and Harrington gestured to it as though granting her a gift. "Whenever you're ready," he said, stepping aside. The accompanist looked at her, puzzled. He hadn't even seen her rehearse. Neither had anyone else. That was the point. Jessica had kept to herself, had hummed only in whispers, never pushed her range or drawn attention. To them, she was just a timid amateur, and this moment was about to confirm it. But Jessica didn't look at anyone. She focused on the page, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and then nodded to the pianist. What happened next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It was precise. Controlled. Devastating. The first note that left her lips was pure, haunting in its clarity, and completely unexpected. The room shifted. A silence thicker than disbelief took hold. Even Harrington stopped breathing. Jessica sang like someone possessed, not by ego or pride, but by memory, by loss, by something unspoken that lived in the spaces between notes. The music didn't come from her throat, it came from somewhere deeper, somewhere only pain could touch. She didn't act Violetta's sorrow. She was it. No one interrupted. No one dared to move. The aria unfolded not as a performance but as a confession. When it ended, the last note hanging in the air like smoke, Jessica opened her eyes. No one clapped. No one spoke. Not even Harrington. But in the echo of that silence, something irreversible had shifted. And still, no one knew who she really was. Not yet. There was a peculiar stillness in the rehearsal room after Jessica finished singing, the kind that follows something so raw and unexpected that the mind needs time to recalibrate. Professor Harrington didn't move. His arms were crossed, but his knuckles had whitened against his sleeves. The students around him sat in stunned silence, many of them avoiding each other's eyes, too unsure of what they had just witnessed to even know how to respond. Jessica, calm and almost expressionless, returned quietly to her seat in the back row, her gaze never meeting anyone's. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't even look relieved. She looked like someone who had let something buried out into the light, only to discover it was still alive and breathing. The class dispersed slowly after that, conversations whispered behind half-closed doors, speculative glances tossed over shoulders. No one dared to speak to her directly, but her presence now carried weight. She was no longer invisible. She had become a mystery, and in Harrington's world, mysteries were threats. For the rest of the week, he avoided her. Not obviously. He maintained the schedule, the lessons, the critiques. But whenever it came time to call on volunteers, his eyes would pass over her like she wasn't there. It was as if he believed that pretending she hadn't stunned everyone into silence would somehow erase it from memory. But the memory lingered. And worse for him, it lingered on the lips of others. It was on a Thursday afternoon that everything began to unravel. A guest had arrived, a planned visit from a local opera company director named Alan Whitmore, a respected figure known for discovering rising talent and occasionally sitting in on student showcases. Harrington had arranged the visit weeks ago, hoping to show off the promising voices in his summer workshop. He had already chosen 3 students to perform for him, all of them ones he favored, coached with personal attention, molded to reflect his taste. Jessica, of course, wasn't one of them. As the students prepared in the hallway, Jessica remained inside, tidying her things, preparing to leave. She hadn't planned to stay for the showcase. Her role, she had decided, was done. Whatever had driven her to sing that day had been satisfied, or so she thought. Whitmore entered quietly, an older man with a warm demeanor and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Harrington, exchanged pleasantries, then took his seat near the front with a quiet nod. One by one, the selected students sang. Their performances were good, technically solid, emotionally eager, but Whitmore's expression didn't shift much. He clapped politely. He gave a few notes. Harrington beamed beside him, explaining his methodology, pointing out vocal improvements. Then, just as they were preparing to close, Whitmore's voice cut through the quiet chatter. "Is she performing as well?" he asked, pointing casually toward Jessica, who had been halfway through slipping on her coat. Harrington's face stiffened. "She's auditing the course," he replied too quickly. "Not formally enrolled. No prior training. She's here for inspiration, I imagine." But Whitmore didn't look away. "Well, that's a shame. I was told a student here sang Violetta earlier this week with astonishing control. Word gets around. I'd like to hear her, if she's willing." Jessica froze. Slowly, she turned, her fingers still on her coat zipper. Her eyes met Whitmore's, calm, inquisitive, without a trace of condescension. Harrington tried to intervene again, but Whitmore raised a gentle hand. "If she's not comfortable, of course, I won't insist. But I'd be honored." There was a pause that stretched so long it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Jessica set her coat down. She stepped forward. The room was different this time. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It wasn't about the professor, the students, or even the director. It was about something deeper. Something older. Her voice came again, this time darker, more grounded, full of history and choice. Whitmore didn't blink. He leaned in, his fingers curled beneath his chin. The air itself seemed to lean with him. When she finished, the silence didn't last long. Whitmore stood. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't offer compliments. He looked at Harrington, who now stood rigid and pale, and said simply, "You didn't tell me her name." Harrington forced a smile. "She's just, well, we haven't had a formal introduction. I wasn't aware she had that level of experience." "Because you never asked," Jessica said, her voice clear, steady, slicing through the tension like a blade. She turned to Whitmore. "I'm Jessica Lynn Turner." There was a beat of stunned recognition. Whitmore's face shifted, his eyes lit with something like awe. "The Jessica Lynn Turner?" Harrington looked between them, lost. "Who?" Whitmore turned slowly, his gaze now full of realization and, for the first time, deep irritation. "She was the principal soprano at the Royal Opera House in London. Paris. Tokyo. You've taught opera for how long, and you don't know that name?" A wave of murmurs rolled through the room. The students stared at Jessica like she'd suddenly grown a crown. Harrington's mouth opened but no sound came out. Jessica faced him. "I left 10 years ago. After my husband died, I disappeared. I changed my name. I stopped performing. I didn't want to be seen, not like that. And I certainly didn't come here for your approval." Harrington stammered, "If I had known, but you didn't care to know," she said, her voice rising only slightly, not in anger, but in weight. "You never asked where I came from. You only looked at what I wore, how I spoke, where I sat. You judged me before I opened my mouth." The silence returned, heavier now, wrapped in embarrassment and shame. Harrington stepped back, visibly shrinking under the weight of the truth. Whitmore approached Jessica. "We've missed your voice. If you ever consider returning, the Met would be honored." She nodded, not with pride, but with quiet control. "I'll think about it." The room remained still as she gathered her coat, not in a hurry, not performing. When she walked out, no one dared stop her. Behind her, Harrington sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly. He looked at his students, once so easily manipulated, now watching him with something closer to disgust. No one clapped. No one said a word. But something had shifted permanently in that room. And yet, the story wasn't quite over. Because as Jessica left that building and stepped into the fading light of the late afternoon, she knew something was still missing. Closure didn't come from shocking the man who tried to diminish her. Closure had to come from somewhere else, something deeper, more personal. And it was waiting just around the corner. Jessica didn't go home that evening. Not right away. She walked instead, without direction, letting the streets of Seattle pull her forward while the cool summer air kissed her cheeks and the city hummed softly around her. Her coat hung open, her hands deep in her pockets, her heart still echoing with the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. It hadn't been planned. She hadn't meant to reveal herself. But something about that moment, about being pushed, cornered, forced, had ignited a piece of her that refused to stay buried any longer. The applause had never mattered, nor the recognition. What mattered was that her voice was no longer locked away in a place of grief and shame. It had found its way back to her, not through ambition, but through confrontation. Through pain. And now, she was free again. Over the next several days, the story spread, not as gossip, but as reverence. The staff at the Arts Center buzzed with disbelief. Former students of Harrington whispered about it over coffee and in Facebook threads. A few even reached out to Jessica directly, some to apologize for not speaking up during that humiliating moment, others simply to say thank you. Her name, once obscured by silence, began to reclaim its place, this time not as a product of fame, but as a symbol of quiet resilience. But Jessica didn't respond to most of them. She stayed quiet. Still. She wasn't chasing a comeback. She had never been. What she hadn't expected, however, was the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, the handwriting sharp and elegant. Inside was a single page, typed. It wasn't from a journalist, or a student, or a fan. It was from the director of a music foundation, the Barrow Initiative for Artistic Legacy. They were forming a new program, a mentorship for young women in underrepresented communities who wanted to pursue opera but lacked access. And they wanted Jessica to lead it. Not as a performer. Not as a figurehead. But as a guide. A voice of truth. They had heard about the events at the center. They had seen a recording, taken discreetly by one of the students, that showed not only her performance, but the tension, the challenge, the transformation. It had moved them. Inspired them. And they wanted that spirit at the heart of their mission. Jessica held the letter for a long time. Read it twice. Then placed it on her table and stared at the window, letting the idea sink in. She could see the shape of her life bending toward something new. A space where her silence had meaning, where her pain could fuel purpose. Not a return to the spotlight, but a movement into something deeper. She called the number. Accepted the offer. And within weeks, she was in New York, standing in front of a room full of young women with wide eyes and voices like seeds, ready to bloom. For the first time in years, she didn't just feel useful. She felt alive. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Professor Harrington's days began to unravel with quiet precision. Word of his conduct spread quickly, not just the arrogance, but the pattern. Stories emerged from other students, other years, recounting similar humiliations, similar tactics of intimidation. The Arts Center launched an internal review. Sponsors began pulling support. His colleagues, once polite in their indifference, distanced themselves. And though he tried to defend his methods as old-school rigor, the tide had turned. The air around him shifted. Respect drained from his name like color from a photograph. Eventually, the center offered him a choice: resign or face formal removal. He chose resignation, wrapped it in a narrative of pursuing new opportunities, but everyone knew. His reputation didn't survive the shift in perception. He attempted to start a private coaching studio, but very few followed. Trust was broken. And for someone whose identity had been built entirely on perceived authority, the collapse was devastating. He wasn't hated. He was forgotten. And that, for a man like Thomas Harrington, was the cruelest punishment of all. Back in New York, Jessica stood beside a piano in a rehearsal room filled with hope. The girls around her laughed and shared stories between scales, their voices rising into harmonies that felt like dawn. She didn't lecture them. She didn't correct them harshly. She told them stories, real ones. About fear. About doubt. About resilience. She showed them that beauty could come from brokenness. That strength didn't need a spotlight. And when they sang, she saw in them pieces of herself. Not the part that had stood on grand stages, but the part that had survived everything afterward. One afternoon, as she walked through the foundation's quiet halls, she stopped in front of a bulletin board filled with photos. Old performances. Letters from past students. Notes of gratitude. She pinned up a new picture, one taken during her first workshop session. The girls gathered around her, their eyes bright, her arms open. It wasn't glossy. It wasn't staged. But it was everything she had once lost, found again. She didn't sing in public anymore. She didn't need to. Her voice lived in those she lifted. And that was more than enough. Sometimes, healing doesn't look like triumph. Sometimes, it looks like soft steps taken in the right direction after years of standing still. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in applause, but in the quiet collapse of a lie. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply becoming whole again. Now, if you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged by how you look? Ever felt small in a room where you knew you had something powerful inside, but no one cared to see it? What would you do if you had the chance to show the world who you truly are, without warning, without apology? And if someone tried to silence your gift, would you find the courage to let it sing again? If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own voice, your own silence, then tell us, what did it make you feel? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's listen to each other. And don't forget to subscribe to Hope Threads. Because stories like Jessica's, stories of quiet power, of truth breaking through, deserve to be heard.